The 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Episode 1. Self-Directed Warfare. Mastering the Inner Battlefield. Before Robert Greene talks about defeating opponents, building strategic positions, or navigating conflict, he starts somewhere much deeper and honestly much more uncomfortable. He starts with the idea that most people lose wars before the war even begins because they never gain control over themselves. That is the foundation of this entire book. Most people think strategy is external. They think strategy is about manipulating other people, winning arguments, gaining leverage, or positioning themselves correctly in competition. But Greene argues that the first and most important battlefield is internal. Your emotions, your reactions, your ego, your fear, your impulsiveness, your inability to stay calm under pressure. Those are the things that destroy people long before any outside enemy does, and if you think about it carefully, you can see this everywhere in real life. Most careers are not destroyed by lack of talent. Most relationships are not destroyed by lack of intelligence. Most leadership failures are not caused by lack of skill. They collapse because people become emotional, reactive, arrogant, impatient, insecure, or unable to adapt. That is the real battlefield Greene is talking about. The first strategy is what Greene calls declaring war on your enemies. But what he really means is developing clarity. Most people move through life without clearly defining what opposes them. They stay vague. They tolerate bad situations for too long. They avoid uncomfortable truths. They confuse temporary peace with actual stability. Greene argues that this creates weakness because unclear people become controllable people. If you do not clearly identify the behaviors, patterns, habits, and people that consistently work against your goals, you become passive. You stop acting strategically and start reacting emotionally. Now, this does not mean turning life into paranoia or becoming obsessed with enemies. That is actually one of the biggest misunderstandings people have when reading Robert Greene. They assume he is teaching aggression. In reality, he is teaching awareness. There is a difference. Aggressive people often lose control because they become emotional. Aware people stay observant. They recognize patterns early. They notice disrespect, manipulation, incompetence, weakness, and instability before those things grow into larger problems. And that applies everywhere. At work, for example, most people ignore subtle behavior patterns until they become major issues. Someone repeatedly undermines them in meetings. Someone slowly damages their credibility. Someone takes credit for their work. Someone constantly tests boundaries to see what they can get away with. Most people tell themselves, it's probably nothing, I don't want conflict. I'll just ignore it. But Greene's perspective is that avoiding recognition of a problem does not remove the problem. It usually strengthens it. One of the deeper ideas hidden underneath this strategy is that clarity creates energy. When people know exactly what they stand for and exactly what they refuse to tolerate, their decision-making improves dramatically. Indecision drains energy. Ambiguity drains confidence. Unclear priorities create emotional exhaustion. This is why highly strategic people often seem calmer and more focused than everyone else around them. They are not constantly renegotiating their standards internally. They already decided. And one important thing Greene implies throughout this section is that your greatest enemy is often not another person. Sometimes it is your own patterns, your own procrastination, your own need for approval, your own inability to confront reality honestly. Your own comfort-seeking behavior. A lot of people spend years trying to change external circumstances while refusing to confront internal weaknesses that continuously recreate the same outcomes. That is one of the hidden themes running through this entire book. Now, another major principle Greene introduces early is the idea that you must not fight the last war. This is one of the most important strategic concepts in the entire book, because it applies to almost every area of life. What Greene means is simple. Most people become trapped by past experiences. If something worked once, they repeat it automatically. If something hurt them once, they avoid similar situations automatically. If they succeeded using a certain personality style, they freeze themselves into that identity permanently. But reality changes constantly. People change. Power structures change. Social dynamics change. Technology changes. Leadership changes. Incentives change. And yet most people keep using outdated mental models because familiarity feels safe. You see this constantly in workplace environments. Someone had success under one manager using direct confrontation, so they assume that same strategy will work under a completely different personality type. or someone experienced betrayal once, so now they distrust everyone automatically, even when the context is entirely different. Greene's point is that strategic intelligence requires adaptability. And adaptability is much harder than people realize because the human brain loves certainty. It wants shortcuts. It wants patterns. It wants predictable systems. The brain constantly says, "This looks familiar, so respond the same way." But strategic people resist that impulse. They observe first. They study context first. They ask, what is actually happening here? What has changed? What are the hidden dynamics? What assumptions am I making automatically? That pause between stimulus and reaction is one of the biggest separators between reactive people and strategic people. One hidden layer underneath this strategy is that many people unconsciously become emotionally loyal to old versions of themselves. They continue acting like the person they used to be rather than the person the current situation requires. Someone who once needed to be aggressive stays aggressive long after it stops serving them. Someone who once survived by staying quiet remains passive, even when they now need assertiveness. Someone who once succeeded through hard work alone ignores the importance of relationships, visibility, and positioning later in life. Greene is essentially teaching situational intelligence, not rigid identity, not emotional attachment to old methods, not ego-driven consistency, situational awareness. And one of the biggest mistakes people make here is assuming adaptability means weakness or lack of principles. It does not. Your core values can remain stable while your methods evolve constantly. That distinction is critical. Now, Greene transitions into another foundational principle that connects deeply with emotional control. He talks about maintaining presence of mind during chaos. This is where the psychology of warfare becomes extremely relevant to everyday life. Most people completely fall apart under pressure. When tension rises, their thinking narrows, their emotions spike. Their perception becomes distorted. Their decision-making deteriorates. And what makes this dangerous is that people often do not realize it is happening in real time. They believe they are thinking clearly when they are actually reacting emotionally. Greene argues that calmness under pressure is one of the greatest strategic advantages a person can develop, because chaos affects perception. When everyone else becomes reactive, emotional, rushed, and impulsive, the calm person suddenly sees opportunities others miss. You can see this in leadership constantly. In high-stress environments, people naturally gravitate toward whoever appears most emotionally stable. Even if that person is not the smartest in the room, emotional steadiness creates trust. And this applies socially too. People who remain composed during conflict automatically appear more credible than people who become emotionally explosive. One of the deeper insights here is that emotional control is not suppression. Greene is not advocating becoming emotionless. He is talking about separating emotion from decision-making. That is very different. Emotion itself is useful. Emotion contains information. But emotion should not control timing, strategy, or action. Many people destroy their own leverage because they react too early. They reveal frustration too early. They expose insecurity too early. They let temporary emotional states dictate permanent decisions. Strategic people slow themselves down. And slowing down under pressure is a trainable skill. Most people think composure is personality-based, but much of it is conditioning. People who repeatedly expose themselves to controlled stress gradually increase their ability to think clearly under pressure. That is why difficult experiences often create stronger leaders if those experiences are processed correctly. Now, Greene introduces another concept that becomes a recurring theme throughout the entire book: urgency. He argues that comfort is one of the most dangerous psychological states people can enter, because comfort weakens awareness, urgency, and adaptability. When people become too comfortable, they stop preparing. They stop observing carefully. They stop improving. They delay difficult action. They tolerate weakness longer than they should. And eventually, reality forces urgency onto them violently. This is why Greene emphasizes creating constructive pressure intentionally instead of waiting for crisis. The deeper psychological principle here is that humans often require stakes before action happens. Without consequences, people drift. They postpone important conversations. They delay improving their health. They avoid financial discipline. They tolerate inefficient systems. They stay passive in bad environments. Urgency creates movement. But Greene also warns indirectly about a common mistake people make with urgency. Some people confuse urgency with panic. Those are completely different states. Panic destroys judgment. Urgency sharpens focus. Strategic pressure should increase clarity, not emotional chaos. And one practical way this applies in real life is through self-imposed standards and deadlines. High performers often create accountability structures long before external pressure appears. They force movement early. They do not wait until circumstances corner them. One thing that becomes increasingly clear throughout these opening strategies is that Greene views life itself as strategic terrain. Not because life should become cynical or paranoid, but because consequences are real. Patterns matter. Timing matters. Positioning matters. Emotional control matters. Awareness matters. And most people are operating far more emotionally and unconsciously than they realize. The real goal of these opening strategies is not aggression against others. It is mastery of your own perception, emotions, habits, and responses so that you stop becoming predictable, reactive, and easy to destabilize. That is the true beginning of strategic thinking. Core lessons. The first battlefield is internal. If you cannot control your emotions and impulses, outside strategy becomes unstable. Clarity creates power. What you stand for and what consistently works against your goals sharpens decision-making. Do not become trapped by past experiences or old identities. Situational awareness matters more than rigid consistency. Calmness under pressure creates enormous strategic advantage because most people become reactive during chaos. Constructive pressure creates movement. Comfort often leads to stagnation, passivity, and declining awareness. Implementation system, daily actions. Pause before reacting emotionally to stressful situations. Study recurring patterns in your own behavior. Identify where comfort has made you passive. Practice slowing your reactions during pressure instead of speeding them up. Workplace strategy. Pay attention to subtle patterns instead of isolated incidents. Adapt communication styles to the actual environment instead of relying on old habits. Stay composed during stressful situations because emotional steadiness creates authority naturally. Social and personal application. Recognize repeated behaviors people show instead of relying on assumptions or wishful thinking. Separate temporary emotions from long-term decisions. Create personal standards that reduce indecision and ambiguity. If you only remember 3 things. Your greatest enemy is often your own lack of self-control. Most people react based on old experiences instead of current reality. Calmness under pressure creates strategic advantage almost automatically. End of Episode 1. The 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Episode 2. Organizational Warfare. Control the terrain before the battle begins. One of the biggest mistakes people make in life is thinking that success is mostly about effort in the moment. They believe outcomes are determined by who works hardest, who reacts fastest, who argues best, who pushes the hardest during conflict. But Robert Greene introduces a much more strategic idea in this section of the book. Most battles are won before the battle ever starts, and once you begin noticing this principle, you start seeing it everywhere. In workplaces, politics, relationships, leadership, business, even social circles. The people who consistently win are usually not improvising emotionally in the moment. They have already positioned themselves correctly beforehand. That is what Greene means by organizational warfare. It is the art of structuring situations so that you hold the advantage before conflict even begins. And one of the first things Greene emphasizes is the importance of seeing the bigger picture, instead of becoming trapped in immediate emotions and short-term reactions. Most people operate tactically. Strategic people operate structurally. That difference changes everything. Tactical thinking focuses on, what do I do right now? Strategic thinking asks, what position do I need to create so future situations naturally favor me? That is a completely different way of thinking. A reactive employee waits until problems appear and then scrambles emotionally to solve them. A strategic employee quietly builds relationships, credibility, visibility, influence, competence, information networks. So when pressure eventually arrives, they already have leverage. Greene repeatedly emphasizes that preparation often looks invisible from the outside. People usually only notice visible victories, but they miss the long period of positioning that created those victories. This is one of the hidden truths behind power in general. Most powerful people do not appear powerful because of one dramatic moment. Their strength comes from accumulated positioning over time. And this applies even in everyday situations. Think about 2 people entering the exact same workplace conflict. One person has strong relationships, has emotional control, has credibility, has a reputation for competence, understands the internal dynamics. The other is isolated, reactive, politically unaware, emotionally impulsive, unprepared. Even if both people are technically correct, the outcomes will usually be very different, because positioning matters. Now, one of Greene's most important organizational strategies is what he calls avoiding the groupthink trap. He argues that groups naturally drift toward conformity, emotional thinking, and intellectual laziness over time. This is extremely important psychologically. When people operate in groups, they often stop thinking independently because social safety becomes more important than objective analysis. People begin protecting the group's emotions, the group's hierarchy, the group's identity, instead of protecting reality. This is why organizations sometimes continue making obviously terrible decisions even when warning signs are everywhere. Nobody wants to disrupt consensus. And Greene argues that strategic people must resist this pull constantly because emotional group momentum is incredibly powerful. You can see this in workplaces all the time. A failing system continues because nobody wants to challenge leadership openly. A toxic employee remains protected because confronting them feels uncomfortable. A flawed process survives for years because that's how we've always done it. One of the deeper ideas Greene is introducing here is that humans are tribal creatures first and rational creatures second. People desperately want belonging, they want approval, they want safety. And because of that, many people unconsciously sacrifice independent judgment in exchange for social harmony. Strategic thinkers do the opposite. They observe independently even when it creates discomfort internally. Now, this does not mean becoming rebellious for the sake of rebellion. That is another major misunderstanding people have with strategic thinking. Some people read Greene and think strategy means becoming manipulative, confrontational, or oppositional all the time. But unnecessary conflict is inefficient. Greene's real point is that you should maintain independent perception even while functioning within a group. That distinction matters enormously. Now, another major strategy Greene introduces is the importance of dividing forces wisely and maintaining flexibility. Most people overcommit emotionally. They put all their energy into one plan, all their identity into one role, all their confidence into one outcome. And when circumstances shift, they collapse psychologically because they build no flexibility into their structure. Strategic people avoid total dependency whenever possible. They create options. This principle applies financially, professionally, socially, and emotionally. For example, many people make careers emotionally dangerous by tying their entire identity to one boss, one position, or one organization. So if instability appears, panic immediately follows because they built no strategic flexibility. Greene's philosophy repeatedly emphasizes reducing vulnerability through positioning, not paranoia, not fear, not pessimism. Positioning. A person with alternatives thinks differently than a person trapped without options. That psychological difference alone creates power. The person who can walk away calmly usually holds more leverage than the person operating from desperation. One hidden layer behind this section of the book is that strategic freedom often matters more than raw force. Most people chase visible power, titles, authority, dominance, recognition. But Greene constantly points toward a quieter form of strength, mobility, the ability to adapt, the ability to reposition, the ability to survive changing conditions. That is often far more valuable long term. Now, Greene also spends time discussing chains of command and leadership structure. He argues that confusion destroys momentum, and this becomes extremely obvious during pressure situations. When roles are unclear, people hesitate, communication breaks down. Accountability disappears, emotional reactions increase. This is true in organizations, families, businesses, and even personal lives. A lot of stress comes from structural confusion. People do not know who decides what matters most, what priorities exist, what standards apply. Strategic structure reduces unnecessary chaos. And one thing Greene subtly points out is that strong leadership is often less about charisma and more about clarity. People trust leaders who create order, reduce confusion, remain calm under pressure, make decisions decisively. Even imperfect decisions often create more stability than endless uncertainty. Now, another critical idea Greene introduces is controlling the dynamic rather than reacting to it. This is extremely important. Most people unconsciously allow circumstances to dictate their emotional state and behavior. Strategic people try to shape momentum proactively. For example, if someone waits until workplace tensions explode before addressing problems, they are already operating reactively. But someone who notices patterns early and adjusts positioning beforehand controls the terrain more effectively. Greene constantly emphasizes that timing matters. Early intervention is often dramatically easier than late correction. And psychologically, this connects to avoidance behavior. Humans naturally delay uncomfortable action because short-term avoidance feels relieving. But delayed problems usually become larger and more emotionally expensive later. This applies everywhere: health, finances, relationships, leadership, career decisions. Small problems ignored early often become crises later. One of the hidden strategic lessons Greene keeps reinforcing is that disciplined foresight creates disproportionate advantage. Most people only think seriously once pressure becomes unavoidable. Strategic people think earlier. And because they think earlier, they often appear luckier than everyone else. But what looks like luck is usually preparation plus positioning. Now, one of the most important concepts in this entire section is emotional containment inside organizations and groups. Greene argues that emotional instability spreads rapidly through groups. Fear spreads, panic spreads, uncertainty spreads, but calmness spreads too, confidence spreads too, clarity spreads too. This is why leaders who cannot regulate themselves often destabilize entire environments without realizing it. People constantly absorb emotional signals from others. One panicked leader can create widespread dysfunction. One calm leader can stabilize entire groups, and this applies socially too. People are heavily influenced by emotional atmosphere even when they believe they are acting independently. Strategic people understand this and become very careful about the energy they project during pressure situations. Not fake confidence, not performance, not theatrics. Stability. That stability itself becomes influence. Now there is another major hidden layer underneath all these organizational strategies. Greene is really teaching environmental design. Most people try to force better behavior through willpower alone. Strategic thinkers redesign environments. They structure their routines, their relationships, their information flow, their habits, their physical surroundings, their responsibilities, in ways that naturally support desired outcomes. This is one of the deepest strategic principles in the entire book. Your environment quietly shapes your behavior every day, whether you notice it or not. And many people continuously place themselves in environments that reinforce weakness, distraction, emotional chaos, or passivity, while expecting discipline alone to overcome those conditions. Greene's broader philosophy suggests something very different. Do not rely entirely on force. Build systems and positioning that reduce unnecessary vulnerability from the beginning. That is real strategy. Core lessons. Most battles are won before conflict begins through positioning, preparation, and structure. Strategic people think structurally, not just tactically. Groups naturally drift toward conformity and emotional thinking unless independent judgment is maintained. Flexibility creates strength because alternatives reduce desperation and increase leverage. Stable environments and clear structures reduce chaos and improve decision-making dramatically. Implementation system, daily actions. Think beyond immediate reactions and ask what long-term position you are creating. Notice environments that weaken your focus, discipline, or emotional stability. Create systems that reduce dependence on motivation alone. Workplace strategy. Build credibility and relationships before you need them. Observe organizational dynamics instead of blindly following group momentum. Address small problems early before they become larger conflicts. Social and personal application. Protect independent thinking, even when social pressure encourages conformity. Avoid building your identity entirely around one role, person, or outcome. Create flexibility in important areas of life so you are never psychologically trapped. If you only remember 3 things, positioning often matters more than effort in the moment. People who maintain independent perception avoid many group-driven mistakes. Flexibility and alternatives create psychological and strategic power. End of episode 2. The 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Episode 3. Defensive Warfare, Turning Vulnerability into Strength. One of the most dangerous misconceptions people have about strategy is the belief that strength always looks aggressive. Most people associate power with dominance, loudness, constant action, immediate retaliation, visible control. But Robert Greene introduces a much more sophisticated idea in this section of the book. Real strategic strength often comes from restraint. And this is difficult for people to understand because emotionally humans want immediate resolution. We want to respond instantly when challenged. We want to defend our ego immediately. We want to prove ourselves quickly. But Greene argues that emotional urgency is exactly what makes people vulnerable. Defensive warfare is not passive weakness. It is intelligent preservation of position. That distinction changes everything. One of Greene's core principles here is that sometimes the smartest move is not advancing aggressively but strengthening your position until conditions favor you. And in modern life, this applies constantly. You see people destroy careers because they react emotionally to temporary setbacks. You see relationships collapse because people escalate conflicts impulsively. You see leaders create instability because they cannot tolerate uncertainty or delayed gratification. Greene repeatedly emphasizes that survival itself is strategic. People underestimate this because modern culture glorifies visible victories while ignoring the importance of preservation. But historically, many powerful individuals survived precisely because they understood when not to fight. And this introduces one of the deepest themes in the book. Not every battle deserves your energy. This alone can dramatically improve someone's life if they truly understand it. Most people leak enormous amounts of emotional energy into petty conflicts, ego battles, arguments that change nothing, emotional reactions to criticism. Proving them thoroughly, strategic people become selective, not because they are weak, because they understand cost. Every conflict carries emotional cost, mental cost, reputational cost, opportunity cost, time cost. And many people are so emotionally reactive that they never evaluate whether the battle itself is even worth entering. Greene argues that defensive strategy begins with conserving resources. That includes energy, attention, emotional stability, reputation, momentum. One hidden layer beneath this section is that emotional impulsiveness creates exposure. When people become emotional, they reveal their insecurities, their priorities, their weaknesses, their desperation, their need for validation. And once those things become visible, other people can often manipulate them more easily. This is why Greene repeatedly emphasizes emotional discipline as a form of protection. Now, this does not mean becoming cold or detached from reality. That is another misunderstanding people often have with strategic thinking. Greene is not teaching emotional suppression. He is teaching emotional management. There is a major difference. Suppressed emotion eventually leaks out destructively. Managed emotion becomes usable information. Strategic people still feel anger, frustration, fear, and insecurity. They simply do not allow those emotions to immediately dictate behavior. And one of the most powerful defensive strategies Greene introduces is learning how to absorb pressure without collapsing psychologically. This is incredibly important because life constantly applies pressure, criticism, delays, uncertainty, disrespect, failure, betrayal, competition. Most people interpret pressure emotionally. Strategic people interpret pressure informationally. That distinction is massive. Instead of immediately reacting, they ask, what is this situation revealing? What weakness is being exposed? What adjustment needs to happen? What can I learn before responding? That creates adaptability instead of emotional chaos. You can see this clearly in workplace environments. An emotionally reactive employee interprets criticism as personal attack. A strategic employee studies criticism for usable information, even if the delivery was imperfect. That does not mean blindly accepting unfair treatment. It means separating emotion from analysis long enough to think clearly. And Greene repeatedly shows that people who cannot separate those two things become extremely easy to destabilize. Now, another major strategy in this section is the concept of strategic retreat. This is one of the hardest ideas for ego-driven people to accept. Most people associate retreat with humiliation, weakness, failure. But Greene reframes retreat as repositioning. Sometimes continuing a battle destroys more than temporarily stepping back ever would. And historically, many great military leaders survived specifically because they knew when preservation mattered more than pride. This applies everywhere in modern life. Sometimes the smartest career move is leaving an environment that is draining your long-term growth. Sometimes the smartest argument is the one you refuse to escalate. Sometimes the smartest social decision is creating distance instead of trying to control another person's behavior endlessly. But emotionally, humans hate retreat because the ego wants immediate validation. The ego says, if I walk away, I lose. If I stop fighting, they win. If I do not respond immediately, I look weak. Greene argues that this thinking traps people into unnecessary destruction. One of the hidden truths here is that strategic retreat often preserves future power. Many people destroy long-term opportunities because they cannot tolerate short-term discomfort to their ego. Now, another important principle Greene discusses is making yourself difficult to attack directly. This is a fascinating concept because most people unknowingly make themselves highly vulnerable through predictability. Predictable emotional patterns are easy to manipulate. If someone knows exactly what angers you, exactly what flatters you, exactly what triggers insecurity, exactly what causes emotional reactions, then controlling your behavior becomes easier. Greene repeatedly emphasizes reducing predictability, not by becoming fake or dishonest, but by becoming more emotionally disciplined and less automatically reactive. One of the deepest strategic advantages a person can develop is emotional unreadability under pressure. Because when people cannot easily predict your reactions, they lose leverage. This becomes extremely important in negotiations, leadership, conflict, and social dynamics. Most people reveal too much too quickly. They reveal desperation, excitement, fear, neediness, frustration. And once revealed, those emotions often shape the entire interaction. Strategic people slow emotional exposure down. Now, another critical defensive principle Greene introduces is controlling access. This idea is far deeper than most people initially realize. Everything you allow consistent access to shapes you psychologically. The people around you shape your thinking, your standards, your energy, your emotional state, your habits, your level of discipline, and many people constantly expose themselves to environments and individuals that weaken them emotionally while expecting to remain mentally strong. That rarely works long term. Greene's broader philosophy suggests that strategic people become extremely aware of influence, not paranoid, not isolated, aware. They understand that repeated exposure creates normalization. If someone spends enough time around, negativity, chaos, weakness, emotional instability, constant distraction, those things gradually affect perception and behavior whether they consciously notice it or not. One hidden layer underneath defensive warfare is that protection is not just physical or external, it is psychological, protecting your attention, your emotional stability, your clarity, your confidence, your focus, may actually matter more in modern life than many external threats. Now, Greene also emphasizes the importance of patience. This is one of the rarest strategic traits because modern environments reward immediacy constantly. Immediate response, immediate opinion, immediate gratification, immediate emotional release. But patience creates perspective, and perspective changes decisions dramatically. Many situations that feel emotionally overwhelming in the moment look completely different after time passes. Strategic people understand this and avoid making permanent decisions inside temporary emotional states whenever possible. This alone prevents enormous damage. A huge amount of human regret comes from emotional decisions made too quickly, reactions made without perspective, escalations driven by pride, impulses mistaken for truth. Greene's philosophy repeatedly pushes toward one core idea. The person who controls themselves under pressure controls far more of the situation than they realize. That is real defensive strength. Not fragility pretending to be aggression. Not emotional explosions mistaken for confidence. Not constant confrontation mistaken for courage. Actual internal stability. And one of the deepest insights in this entire section is that defensive warfare is ultimately about preserving your ability to think clearly. Because once emotion fully controls perception, strategic thinking collapses. Core lessons. Not every battle deserves your energy, attention, or emotional investment. Emotional impulsiveness creates vulnerability and predictability. Strategic retreat is often preservation, not weakness. Protecting your emotional environment matters more than most people realize. Patience creates perspective, and perspective improves decision-making dramatically. Implementation system. Daily actions. Delay emotional reactions during stressful situations. Observe which environments drain your focus and stability. Practice separating emotional feelings from immediate decisions. Workplace strategy. Avoid unnecessary ego conflicts that damage long-term positioning. Treat criticism as information before treating it emotionally. Remain difficult to destabilize through calmness and consistency. Social and personal application. Limit exposure to chronically negative or chaotic influences. Stop interpreting every disagreement as a battle that must be won. Preserve emotional energy for conflicts that actually matter long-term. If you only remember three things, the ability to stay emotionally controlled under pressure is a major strategic advantage. Walking away strategically is often smarter than escalating emotionally. What you repeatedly expose yourself to gradually shapes your thinking and behavior. End of episode 3. The 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene, Episode 4, Offensive Warfare, Seizing Initiative and Controlling Momentum. One of the clearest patterns throughout history is that people who constantly remain reactive eventually lose control of their lives. Not necessarily all at once, not dramatically, usually gradually. They become trapped in cycles of responding instead of shaping, defending instead of advancing, adapting to other people's agendas instead of creating their own. And Robert Greene argues that this is one of the most dangerous positions a person can stay in long term. Because once you are permanently reacting, you surrender momentum. This is where Greene transitions into offensive warfare. Now, when people hear the word offensive, they usually imagine aggression, domination, confrontation, or recklessness. But Greene's definition is much more strategic than emotional. Offensive warfare is about initiative. It is about forcing reality to respond to you, instead of endlessly responding to reality. And psychologically, this matters enormously because momentum shapes confidence. People who consistently act proactively begin feeling more powerful because they stop experiencing themselves as passive participants in their own lives. One of the deepest ideas Greene introduces here is that hesitation creates weakness, not thoughtful patience, not calculated timing. Hesitation, there is a major difference. Strategic patience is controlled. Hesitation is fearful. Most people hesitate because they are waiting for certainty. But certainty almost never arrives fully. And this is one of the hidden truths behind high performers in every field. Most successful people are not operating with complete certainty internally. They simply act before overthinking destroys momentum. Meanwhile, many intelligent people remain stuck for years because they continually wait for perfect timing, perfect confidence, perfect conditions, perfect clarity. Greene argues that excessive caution often creates its own failure. And you can see this everywhere in real life. Someone delays applying for opportunities because they do not feel fully ready. Someone delays difficult conversations because discomfort feels threatening. Someone delays improving their health because the process feels overwhelming. Someone delays building skills because they fear looking inexperienced initially. The problem is that delay slowly becomes identity. People begin seeing themselves as someone who waits, someone who hesitates, someone who thinks but never moves. And over time, inaction compounds psychologically. Now, Greene also emphasizes the importance of speed and surprise in offensive strategy. This principle appears repeatedly throughout military history because people are highly vulnerable during transition and uncertainty. And prepare for predictable behavior. Unexpected action disrupts psychological stability. And in everyday life, this matters more than most people realize. The person who speaks directly, moves early, adapts quickly, often gains disproportionate advantage simply because most people move slowly through uncertainty. Now, this does not mean recklessness. That is another common misunderstanding. He is not advocating impulsive action. He is advocating decisive action once observation and preparation have occurred. That distinction matters enormously. Impulsive people create chaos. Strategic people create momentum. Very different outcomes. One hidden layer beneath this strategy is that speed often creates psychological authority. People unconsciously associate decisiveness with competence, even when information is incomplete. That is why hesitant leadership often creates instability inside organizations. Constant uncertainty erodes confidence. Even imperfect movement can sometimes create more momentum than endless analysis. Now, Greene introduces another offensive principle that becomes incredibly important in modern environments, attacking weakness indirectly instead of confronting strength directly. This is one of the most sophisticated strategic ideas in the book because emotionally humans usually want direct confrontation. The ego wants visible victory. It wants dramatic resolution. It wants immediate proof of strength. But Greene repeatedly argues that direct collisions are often inefficient and unnecessarily costly. Strategic people look for leverage points instead. This applies everywhere. In workplace dynamics, for example, many people waste enormous energy confronting authority emotionally head-on, without understanding the broader structure around that authority. Sometimes indirect influence works far better. Building alliances, strengthening reputation, expanding competence, increasing visibility, creating alternatives. Those things shift power quietly. And one of the deeper insights Greene keeps reinforcing is that visible force is often less effective than strategic positioning. Most people focus on surface conflict. Strategic people focus on systems. Now, another major offensive Greene discusses is occupying moral high ground psychologically. This is extremely important because humans do not operate purely rationally. People justify behavior emotionally and morally first, then rationalize afterward. And Greene understands that perception shapes outcomes almost as much as objective reality. People support individuals they perceive as controlled, principled, disciplined, calm, purpose-driven. Meanwhile, emotional instability weakens credibility rapidly. This is why many people lose influence not because they are wrong, but because their emotional reactions damage perception. One hidden layer here is that emotional self-control often functions as social proof of competence. People trust those who appear internally stable. And strategically, this creates enormous advantage because perception affects leadership opportunities, influence, credibility, negotiation outcomes, social positioning. Now, Greene also introduces one of the most important offensive concepts in the entire book, forcing people onto unfamiliar terrain. This idea is psychological at its core. Humans become weaker when removed from familiar patterns and environments. People rely heavily on routine mentally, predictable conversations, predictable emotional patterns, predictable structures, predictable identities. When those patterns break suddenly, confidence often drops. Strategic people understand this and avoid allowing opponents or competitors to keep interactions inside predictable territory. In modern life, this can mean asking unexpected questions, changing negotiation structure, introducing new variables, refusing emotionally predictable reactions, breaking repetitive patterns. One of the hidden truths Greene repeatedly points toward is that predictability creates vulnerability. Most people become easy to read over time. They always react the same way, always argue the same way, always defend themselves the same way, always become emotional at the same triggers. And once people can predict your emotional map, controlling interactions becomes easier. Strategic unpredictability disrupts that. Not instability, not randomness, controlled unpredictability. That distinction matters. Now, another major offensive principle Greene discusses is maintaining relentless pressure once momentum shifts in your favor. This is psychologically fascinating because most people relax too early. The moment things improve, discipline fades, focus weakens, awareness drops, preparation slows. Humans naturally drift toward comfort extremely quickly. But Greene argues that momentum must be consolidated before relaxation occurs. This is true everywhere. Someone starts improving financially and immediately increases unnecessary spending. Someone begins succeeding professionally and stops learning aggressively. Someone improves physically and becomes complacent. Often creates vulnerability. And one hidden layer underneath offensive warfare is that maintaining momentum is often psychologically harder than creating momentum initially. Sustaining requires discipline. Now, Greene also emphasizes concentration of force. Most people scatter energy constantly. Too many goals, too many distractions, too many unfinished pursuits, too many emotional conflicts competing for attention. Strategic people concentrate effort deliberately. And this becomes increasingly valuable in modern environments because distraction is everywhere. Attention itself becomes strategic territory. People who cannot focus deeply become fragmented psychologically. Their energy leaks into constant stimulation, endless reaction, emotional noise, low-value conflicts, digital distraction. Greene's philosophy repeatedly points toward intentional concentration, not constant activity, directed energy. And one of the deepest insights in this section is that offensive warfare is ultimately about shaping reality, instead of merely surviving it. Reactive people spend life adjusting endlessly. Strategic people gradually create conditions that favor them. That does not mean controlling everything. No one controls everything. But it does mean refusing to live entirely at the mercy of randomness, emotional reaction, or external pressure. Greene is teaching proactive positioning at the psychological level. The ability to move intentionally instead of drifting unconsciously. Core lessons. People who constantly remain reactive eventually lose momentum and positioning. Strategic action requires decisiveness, not reckless impulsiveness. Indirect leverage is often more effective than direct emotional confrontation. Predictability creates vulnerability, while controlled unpredictability creates leverage. Momentum must be maintained deliberately because comfort weakens awareness and discipline quickly. Implementation system, daily actions. Make decisions faster once sufficient information exists. Notice where hesitation is really fear disguised as caution. Reduce distractions that fragment your focus and attention. Workplace strategy. Look for leverage points instead of unnecessary direct confrontation. Become known for calm decisiveness under pressure. Build momentum consistently instead of relying on emotional motivation. Social and personal application. Avoid becoming emotionally predictable. Create opportunities proactively instead of waiting passively. Protect concentration and focus from constant distraction. If you only remember 3 things, people who shape momentum usually gain more control over outcomes than people who only react. Hesitation often creates more damage than imperfect action. Focused and directed energy is far more powerful than scattered effort. End of Episode 4. The 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Episode 5. Unconventional Warfare, Psychological Strategy and the Art of Disruption. One of the biggest advantages a person can develop in life is becoming difficult to control mentally. Not emotionally numb, not detached from reality, not rebellious for the sake of rebellion. Mentally independent. And Robert Greene spends a large part of the 33 Strategies of War exploring this idea through unconventional warfare. Because one of the central truths Greene understands is that most battles are psychological long before they become external. People are constantly fighting for attention, perception, influence, emotional control, narrative dominance, psychological positioning. And the people who understand the psychological dimension of conflict usually hold far more power than people who focus only on surface-level events. One of the first unconventional strategies Greene introduces is the importance of operating outside expectations. This is incredibly powerful because humans rely heavily on prediction to feel psychologically safe. We constantly build mental models of people, how they react, what they value, what triggers them, what role they play, what behavior to expect. And once those patterns become fixed, people begin interacting with the prediction instead of the actual person. This creates an enormous strategic opportunity. Because if someone fully believes they understand you, they often lower awareness around you. Greene repeatedly points out that predictability creates exposure. You can see this constantly in social dynamics. Some people become so emotionally repetitive that everyone around them knows exactly how to manipulate them. They know what compliments work, what insults trigger reactions, what creates insecurity, what creates emotional escalation. And over time, those predictable patterns become invisible chains. The person feels free while unconsciously reacting on command. Greene argues that strategic people break automatic patterns deliberately, not randomly, not theatrically. Strategically. This is an important distinction because some people misunderstand unpredictability and become chaotic instead. Chaos is not strategy. True strategic unpredictability is controlled variation. It is the ability to respond based on the situation instead of emotional habit. One hidden layer underneath this idea is that many people unconsciously build rigid identities around themselves. I'm the aggressive one. I'm the quiet one. I'm the nice one. I'm the tough one. And once identity becomes rigid, flexibility disappears. Greene repeatedly warns against becoming trapped by fixed self-images, because rigid identity creates strategic blindness. Protecting the image instead of responding intelligently to reality. This becomes incredibly dangerous in leadership, conflict, and personal growth. People often continue behaving in ways that no longer serve them simply because they are emotionally attached to who they think they are. Strategic people maintain adaptability without losing core values. Now, another major unconventional strategy Greene discusses is attacking perception instead of force directly. This is one of the deepest ideas in the entire book, because perception shapes reality more than objective truth does. Humans respond emotionally first and analytically second. People support narratives, stories, emotional framing, identity alignment. And Greene understands that controlling perception changes outcomes dramatically. This applies everywhere. In workplace environments, the person perceived as calm, competent, and stable often gains more influence than the loudest or most technically capable individual. In leadership, perception shapes trust. In conflict, perception shapes credibility. In negotiations, perception shapes leverage. And one of the hidden truths here is that perception compounds over time. Repeated impressions slowly become reputation. Reputation becomes expectation. Expectation begins shaping opportunity itself. This is why Greene repeatedly emphasizes the importance of controlling emotional presentation under pressure. Not fake performance, not manipulation, awareness. Most people underestimate how heavily emotional appearance influences judgment. A person who appears desperate loses leverage. A person who appears emotionally grounded gains influence automatically. Now, one of the most fascinating unconventional strategies Greene discusses is the use of absence. This is psychologically powerful because humans often undervalue what feels constantly available. Availability lowers perceived value over time, and Greene repeatedly points out that strategic withdrawal can increase attention, respect, and psychological weight dramatically. This principle appears in leadership, negotiation, relationships, social dynamics, communication. People who constantly explain themselves, constantly seek validation, or constantly force visibility often weaken their own presence unintentionally. Meanwhile, people who speak carefully, move intentionally, and avoid unnecessary exposure often create stronger psychological impact. One hidden layer here is that scarcity affects perception emotionally. Humans are naturally drawn toward what feels rare, what feels controlled, what feels difficult to access, what appears selective, and Greene understands this deeply. Now, this does not mean becoming emotionally distant or manipulative. Again, Greene's ideas are often misunderstood because people confuse strategy with dishonesty. That is not the point. The deeper lesson is about intentionality. Do not overshare impulsively. Do not overexpose yourself emotionally. Do not constantly seek reassurance externally. Preserve some psychological space. Now, Greene also explores one of the most important unconventional principles in the entire book, attacking systems indirectly instead of confronting symptoms endlessly. This is a massive shift in thinking. Most people fight surface-level problems repeatedly without identifying the deeper structure creating those problems. For example, someone repeatedly struggles financially but never changes spending behavior or environment. Someone repeatedly experiences toxic relationships but never examines emotional patterns attracting those dynamics. Someone repeatedly experiences workplace conflict but never studies communication style, positioning, or boundaries. Greene argues that strategic people search for root structures instead of endlessly reacting to symptoms. This is one of the biggest differences between tactical thinking and strategic thinking. Tactical thinking solves immediate fires. Strategic thinking redesigns the conditions creating the fires. And one hidden layer here is that many people unconsciously become addicted to reaction because reaction feels emotionally stimulating. Constant reacting creates the illusion of engagement while deeper patterns remain untouched. Real strategic change often feels slower initially because it requires structural adjustment instead of emotional reaction. Now, another unconventional strategy Greene introduces is psychological contrast. Humans judge things comparatively, not objectively. This affects leadership, persuasion, attraction, negotiation, influence. Greene repeatedly demonstrates that changing context often changes perception more effectively than force itself. This is why timing and sequencing matter so much strategically. A calm response after emotional chaos appears stronger. Silence after constant noise appears more powerful. Discipline inside disorder stands out dramatically. And one hidden truth underneath this principle is that emotional environments shape perception constantly. People rarely evaluate things in isolation. They evaluate comparatively. Strategic people understand this and position themselves accordingly. Now, Greene also spends time discussing morale and emotional atmosphere. This is one of the most overlooked aspects of influence. Most people focus entirely on logic while ignoring emotional energy completely. But groups are emotional organisms. Confidence spreads, fear spreads, panic spreads, calmness spreads, discipline spreads. And Greene repeatedly emphasizes that emotional atmosphere often determines outcomes before technical skill does. You can see this everywhere. Teams collapsing psychologically under pressure. Leaders unintentionally spreading anxiety. Organizations becoming emotionally fragile. Social groups amplifying negativity. One emotionally unstable person can affect entire environments. And one hidden layer here is that humans unconsciously synchronize emotionally with those around them. Strategic people become highly aware of the energy they repeatedly expose themselves to and project outward. Now, another major unconventional principle Greene introduces is refusing obvious paths. This is psychologically difficult because humans crave certainty and familiarity. Most people choose predictable routes because predictable routes feel safer emotionally. But predictable routes are often crowded, saturated, and highly competitive. Strategic people sometimes create disproportionate advantage simply by seeing opportunities others ignore because they are too psychologically attached to conventional thinking. This requires independent perception, not rebellion for attention, not irrational risk-taking, independent observation. And one of the deepest lessons Greene repeatedly reinforces throughout unconventional warfare is this: most people are psychologically programmed far more than they realize, programmed by habits, emotional triggers, social conditioning, group pressure, identity attachment, predictable routines. Strategic awareness begins when you start recognizing those patterns consciously instead of automatically obeying them. That is where real freedom starts emerging psychologically. Core lessons. Predictability creates vulnerability, while controlled unpredictability creates leverage. Perception often shapes outcomes as strongly as objective reality. Strategic withdrawal and intentional absence can increase influence and psychological weight. Most people fight symptoms repeatedly instead of changing the systems creating the problems. Emotional atmosphere strongly influences groups, organizations, and decision-making. Implementation system. Daily actions. Notice emotional habits and predictable reactions. Reduce impulsive oversharing and emotional exposure. Study root causes instead of repeatedly reacting to symptoms. Workplace strategy. Control emotional presentation during stressful situations. Build a reputation for steadiness and intentionality. Look for structural solutions instead of temporary fixes. Social and personal application. Avoid rigid identity labels that reduce adaptability. Protect your psychological environment from chronic negativity. Practice independent thinking instead of automatic social conformity. If you only remember three things, people become easier to manipulate when their reactions become predictable. Perception and emotional presentation shape influence constantly. Real strategic thinking focuses on root structures, not surface-level reactions. End of Episode 5. The 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Episode 6, Dirty Warfare, Manipulation, Deception, and the Hidden Reality of Human Conflict. This is the section of the book where Robert Greene becomes deeply uncomfortable for a lot of people. Because up to this point, many of the strategies could still be interpreted as self-discipline, leadership, emotional control, positioning, and awareness. But now Greene starts addressing something most people prefer to avoid entirely. Human beings are not always honest actors. People manipulate, people conceal motives, people distort reality, people protect self-interest, people perform socially, people compete psychologically while pretending they are not competing. And Greene's argument is not necessarily that this is good. His argument is that pretending it does not exist makes you vulnerable. That is an important distinction. One of the biggest themes in this section is that many people lose conflicts because they insist on interpreting human behavior through idealism instead of reality. They assume everyone communicates honestly, everyone operates fairly, everyone has pure intentions, everyone values loyalty equally, everyone follows stated principles consistently. But Greene repeatedly demonstrates that people often say one thing while wanting another, and strategic blindness begins when someone refuses to acknowledge this. Now, this does not mean becoming paranoid or cynical toward everyone. That is one of the easiest ways to misread Greene completely. Paranoia destroys judgment just as badly as naivete. Greene's actual point is awareness. Observe behavior carefully, separate words from patterns, study incentives, pay attention to consistency over image. One hidden layer underneath this section is that humans are highly motivated by self-preservation psychologically. People want status, security, recognition, advantage, validation, control, and many behaviors that appear irrational emotionally become understandable once you identify the underlying incentive structure. This is one of Greene's deepest recurring themes. People are often driven more by emotional incentives than logical principles. That is why understanding psychology matters strategically. Now, one of the first dirty warfare strategies Greene explores is concealment. This idea makes many people uncomfortable because modern culture often glorifies total transparency emotionally. But Greene argues that complete transparency can create vulnerability. Not because honesty is weakness, because unrestricted exposure removes strategic protection. Most people reveal too much too quickly: their intentions, their insecurities, their emotional state, their plans, their desperation, their fears. And once exposed, those things can influence how others treat them. This is especially important in competitive environments. For example, in workplace settings, someone who constantly reveals emotional frustration publicly may unintentionally weaken their own credibility and positioning, even if their frustrations are valid. Meanwhile, someone who remains emotionally composed and strategically selective about what they reveal often maintains greater leverage. One hidden layer beneath concealment is emotional pacing. Strategic people do not necessarily hide everything. They control timing. That is different from dishonesty. Greene repeatedly emphasizes the importance of managing information flow rather than impulsively exposing every internal reaction immediately. Now, another major strategy Greene introduces is misdirection. This is one of the oldest principles in warfare because humans naturally focus attention narrowly. People usually notice the obvious movement, the visible conflict, the loudest signal, while missing quieter structural changes happening elsewhere. And this applies constantly in modern life. People become distracted by surface drama while deeper shifts occur underneath. Organizational changes, relationship power shifts, financial positioning, reputation development, social alliances. Strategic people learn to observe beyond immediate emotional noise. One hidden insight Greene repeatedly reinforces is that attention itself is a battlefield. Whatever controls attention often controls perception. And modern environments amplify this dramatically because constant stimulation fragments awareness continuously. People become easier to manipulate when distracted emotionally. Now, Greene also spends significant time discussing the role of ambiguity. This is psychologically fascinating because humans desperately want certainty. We want clear answers, clear intentions, clear labels, clear emotional resolution. But ambiguity creates psychological instability. And strategic people sometimes use this intentionally. For example, a person who remains emotionally difficult to read often gains leverage because uncertainty increases caution in others. Meanwhile, highly reactive people become easy to predict and therefore easier to influence. Now again, Greene is not necessarily encouraging manipulation for its own sake here. He is teaching recognition, because many people are already affected by these dynamics without realizing it. One hidden layer underneath ambiguity is projection. When information is incomplete, people fill gaps emotionally. They project their fears, their assumptions, their insecurities, their desires onto the situation. Strategic people understand this and avoid becoming psychologically trapped by assumptions too quickly. Now, another major dirty warfare principle Greene discusses is exploiting emotional weakness carefully. This is where the material becomes morally uncomfortable, but also realistic. Because whether people like it or not, emotional weaknesses heavily influence human behavior. Flattery works, fear works, validation works, insecurity works, social pressure works. Entire industries operate around this reality: advertising, politics, media, social platforms, negotiation, sales. Greene's argument is that understanding psychological leverage is necessary because people constantly attempt to influence one another consciously and unconsciously. And one hidden truth here is that most manipulation succeeds because people desperately want emotional comfort. People ignore obvious warning signs because they want reassurance. People trust too quickly because they crave certainty. People become loyal too quickly because they fear isolation. Strategic awareness means recognizing emotional vulnerabilities without becoming controlled by them automatically. Now, one of the most important principles Greene introduces in this section is the importance of maintaining your own internal center. Because manipulative environments often work by destabilizing perception emotionally. Confusion, pressure, mixed signals, fear, validation cycles, social isolation. These things weaken independent judgment over time. And Greene repeatedly emphasizes that strategic people maintain internal grounding instead of allowing outside emotional pressure to constantly reshape their thinking. This becomes extremely important in toxic workplaces, dysfunctional relationships, high-pressure organizations, competitive environments. One hidden layer underneath this entire section is that emotional independence creates resistance to manipulation. People who require constant validation become easier to control. People who fear disapproval excessively become easier to pressure. People who cannot tolerate uncertainty become easier to influence emotionally. Internal stability creates strategic protection. Now, Greene also discusses the danger of moral self-righteousness. This is extremely important because many people unconsciously blind themselves through moral certainty. They assume I'm right, therefore I'm safe, I'm honest, therefore others must be honest. I have good intentions, therefore outcomes will work out. But Greene argues that reality does not reward intention automatically. Reality responds to awareness, positioning, timing, perception, and behavior patterns. And one hidden layer here is that self-righteousness often reduces observation. People stop studying reality carefully because they become emotionally attached to their own self-image. Strategic people remain observant even when emotionally uncomfortable truths appear. Now, one of the deepest lessons in this section is that manipulation often succeeds gradually rather than dramatically. Very few people are controlled all at once. Instead, boundaries shift slowly. Standards erode slowly. Perception changes slowly. Confidence weakens slowly. This is why awareness matters so much. Most dangerous dynamics begin subtly, and Greene repeatedly pushes readers toward pattern recognition rather than emotional denial. Not paranoia, not obsession, awareness. Because the person who sees clearly usually has more options than the person trapped inside emotional confusion. Core lessons. People often operate through incentives, emotions, and self-interest, rather than stated principles alone. Complete emotional transparency can create unnecessary vulnerability. Attention and perception are forms of strategic territory. Manipulation often works gradually through emotional destabilization and repeated influence. Internal emotional stability creates resistance to psychological pressure and manipulation. Implementation system. Daily actions. Observe behavior patterns instead of relying only on words. Pause before revealing emotional reactions impulsively. Pay attention to incentives driving situations and people. Workplace strategy. Protect emotional composure in competitive environments. Avoid oversharing frustrations or insecurities publicly. Study organizational dynamics beneath surface appearances. Social and personal application. Strengthen emotional independence from validation and approval. Recognize gradual shifts in boundaries and respect. Separate emotional assumptions from observable patterns consistently. If you only remember 3 things, people often reveal their true priorities through patterns, not words. Emotional self-control protects against manipulation and destabilization. Awareness matters more than naive optimism or paranoid suspicion. End of Episode 6. The 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Episode 7. Grand Strategy, Seeing Life as a Long-Term Campaign. As the 33 Strategies of War progresses, Robert Greene gradually moves away from individual tactics and starts focusing on something much bigger. Grand Strategy. And this is where the book begins tying everything together, because Greene's deeper message is not really about conflict alone. It is about learning how to think across long periods of time, instead of becoming trapped by immediate emotions, temporary setbacks, and short-term impulses. Most people live tactically. They focus on today's frustration, today's mood, today's pressure, today's problem, today's emotional reaction. And because of that, they constantly sacrifice long-term positioning for short-term emotional relief. This is one of the biggest strategic weaknesses human beings have. We are naturally wired to prioritize immediate emotional comfort over delayed long-term advantage. And Greene repeatedly shows throughout history how destructive this becomes. Entire careers collapse because people chase short-term ego validation. Leaders lose influence because they react emotionally to temporary criticism. People sabotage financial stability for immediate gratification. Relationships deteriorate because neither person thinks beyond the current emotional moment. Grand strategy is the opposite mindset. It asks, what creates advantage over years, not days? What position am I building long-term? What patterns compound over time? What sacrifices today strengthen tomorrow? That shift alone changes decision-making dramatically. One hidden layer beneath this section is that strategic people emotionally detach from temporary turbulence better than most people. Not because they do not care, because they understand scale. Most situations feel larger emotionally in the moment than they actually are in the long run. A temporary embarrassment feels permanent. A temporary setback feels catastrophic. A temporary delay feels unbearable. But Greene repeatedly emphasizes perspective. People who constantly zoom into short-term emotional reactions lose the ability to navigate strategically. You can see this clearly in workplaces. Someone receives criticism and immediately reacts emotionally instead of thinking, how do I strengthen my long-term position? Someone experiences one setback and abandons an entire path prematurely. Someone becomes obsessed with proving themselves in one moment instead of quietly building reputation over years. Strategic people think differently. They understand that consistency compounds. Now, one of the major principles Greene introduces in this section is the importance of avoiding emotional overextension. This is extremely important because many people unconsciously destroy long-term momentum through unsustainable intensity. Humans are emotionally inconsistent creatures. People become highly motivated temporarily and then crash repeatedly because they rely too heavily on emotional energy instead of systems, pacing, and sustainability. Greene repeatedly warns against burning yourself out through constant emotional warfare, because exhaustion weakens judgment, patience, discipline, emotional control, strategic awareness. And one hidden truth here is that many people secretly operate through cycles of emotional extremes: extreme motivation, extreme frustration, extreme ambition, extreme exhaustion, then repeat. But grand strategy requires steadiness, not emotional chaos, sustained positioning. This is why Greene repeatedly emphasizes rhythm and pacing. Sometimes slowing down strategically creates more long-term progress than forcing constant aggression. Now, another major principle Greene explores is adaptation across time. One of the biggest dangers in life is becoming outdated psychologically. People become emotionally attached to old identities, old strategies, old environments, old successes, old assumptions, and eventually reality changes while they stay mentally frozen. Greene repeatedly demonstrates how dangerous this becomes historically. Powerful people often collapse not because they suddenly became unintelligent, but because they stopped adapting. They assumed previous success guaranteed future success. This is one of the hidden reasons why humility matters strategically. Humility keeps observation alive. Arrogance blinds people to changing conditions. And Greene repeatedly shows that environments constantly evolve, technology changes, organizations change, power structures change, social values change, human incentives change. Strategic people remain flexible enough to evolve with changing terrain. Now, this does not mean abandoning core values constantly. Again, Greene's ideas are often misunderstood here. Adaptation is not lack of identity. It is situational intelligence. One hidden layer underneath this section is that survival itself is adaptive. Rigid people break under pressure more easily because they resist adjustment emotionally. Flexible people reposition internal stability. This is why some individuals recover from failure much faster than others. They adapt instead of emotionally attaching themselves to one fixed version of reality. Now, another major grand strategy Greene discusses is controlling emotional tempo. This is one of the deepest the entire book. Most people allow outside events to dictate their internal pace completely. If something exciting happens, they become impulsive. If something stressful happens, they become rushed. If something uncertain happens, they become anxious. Their internal state constantly reacts to external stimuli. Strategic people develop greater control over pacing. They know when to accelerate, when to pause, when to wait, when to move decisively. And one hidden truth here is that emotional timing changes outcomes dramatically. Many people fail, not because their goals are impossible, but because their pacing is unsustainable. They rush growth, rush relationships, rush decisions, rush conflict, rush success, then create instability themselves. Greene repeatedly emphasizes that impatience destroys positioning. One of the most powerful strategic advantages a person can develop is the ability to tolerate gradual progress without losing discipline emotionally. Now, Greene also introduces the importance of maintaining vision during difficult periods. This is critical because temporary hardship narrows perception psychologically. When people become stressed, they often lose access to long-term thinking entirely. Pressure creates tunnel vision. People start focusing only on immediate relief instead of strategic outcomes. And this is where many individuals abandon paths prematurely. They confuse temporary difficulty with permanent failure. Strategic people understand that resistance and discomfort are often normal parts of meaningful growth. One hidden layer here is that many people unconsciously seek emotional certainty before commitment. But long-term strategy requires movement despite incomplete certainty. No one sees the full future clearly. Strategic people simply commit more intelligently and adjust as reality unfolds. Now, another major principle Greene explores is reputation across time. This is extremely important because reputation compounds quietly. Repeated behaviors gradually become identity in other people's minds. And once perceptions solidify, opportunities begin changing automatically. People trust disciplined individuals more. People rely on emotionally stable individuals more. People respect consistency over time. Meanwhile, repeated emotional instability damages trust. Repeated impulsiveness damages credibility. Repeated inconsistency weakens positioning. Greene repeatedly emphasizes that long-term patterns matter more than isolated moments. And one hidden truth underneath this principle is that small repeated actions shape destiny more than dramatic isolated actions do. This applies everywhere: health, money, relationships, career growth, leadership, skill development. Tiny patterns repeated consistently create massive long-term outcomes. Now, one of the deepest ideas in this entire section is Greene's emphasis on life as campaign rather than event. Most people emotionally experience life one event at a time. One criticism defines their week. One setback defines their confidence. One failure defines their identity temporarily. Strategic people zoom out further. They understand no single moment fully defines the campaign. This creates resilience. Because once someone understands life strategically across years instead of emotionally across moments, setbacks stop feeling absolute. Temporary failure becomes information instead of identity. And this may be one of Greene's deepest lessons overall. Strategic thinking creates emotional stability because perspective reduces emotional volatility. Core lessons. Short-term emotional thinking often destroys long-term positioning. Consistency and sustainability create more advantage than emotional intensity alone. Adaptability matters because environments constantly change over time. Patience and pacing improve decision-making and preserve momentum. Life is better approached as a long-term campaign rather than isolated emotional moments. Implementation system. Daily actions. Make decisions with long-term consequences in mind. Reduce emotional overreaction to temporary setbacks. Focus on consistency instead of emotional bursts of motivation. Workplace strategy. Build reputation steadily through repeated reliability and composure. Adapt to changing environments instead of relying on outdated approaches. Think about long-term positioning instead of short-term ego victories. Social and personal application. Avoid making permanent decisions inside temporary emotional states. Develop patience with gradual progress. Study recurring patterns in your life instead of obsessing over isolated events. If you only remember 3 things, most people sacrifice long-term advantage for short-term emotional comfort. Consistency and adaptability match emotional intensity. A single moment rarely define of your life. End of episode 7. The 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Integrating the strategies into real life. At this point in the book, Robert Greene has walked through psychological warfare, defensive warfare, offensive warfare, organizational warfare, unconventional warfare, manipulation, momentum, perception, adaptability, and long-term positioning. But the deeper question underneath all of it is this: what is the actual purpose of strategy? Because if someone reads this book superficially, they may think it is about defeating people, controlling situations, or gaining power over others. But that is not really the deepest level of the book. The deeper message is about reducing chaos in your own life by becoming more aware, disciplined, emotionally controlled, and strategically intentional. That is what ties everything together. Throughout the entire book, Greene repeatedly exposes one central human weakness. Most people live reactively. They react to emotions, pressure, fear, ego, social influence, temporary situations, external validation, unconscious habits. And because of that, they rarely feel fully in control of their direction. Their mood changes their decisions. Their environment changes their standards. Other people's behavior changes their confidence. Temporary setbacks change their identity. Greene's philosophy pushes in the opposite direction. He wants people to become psychologically stable enough that they can observe clearly, think independently, control emotional impulses, position themselves intelligently, adapt strategically, maintain long-term direction under pressure. And once you understand that, the entire book starts connecting together differently. The offensive strategies are not just about attack. They are about initiative. The defensive strategies are not just about protection. They're about emotional preservation. The unconventional strategies are not just about manipulation. They are about understanding hidden psychological dynamics. The grand strategies are not just about planning. They are about perspective. Everything in the book points toward one larger idea: strategic awareness creates freedom, because people who understand timing, emotion, perception, human behavior, positioning, incentives, momentum, become far less controlled by randomness and emotional chaos. Now, one of the most important realizations in this final section is that most external conflict is amplified by internal instability. This is why Greene spent so much time emphasizing self-control repeatedly. A person who cannot regulate anger, fear, ego, insecurity, impulsiveness, desperation will constantly create unnecessary problems regardless of intelligence. You can see this constantly in real life. Talented people destroy opportunities because of emotional reactions. Intelligent people sabotage relationships because of pride. Capable leaders collapse under pressure because they cannot regulate themselves internally. Greene repeatedly reinforces the idea that emotional discipline creates strategic clarity. And one hidden layer beneath this is that emotional control increases perception itself. Reactive people stop seeing clearly. Emotion narrows vision. Pressure narrows awareness. Ego distorts interpretation. Strategic people slow themselves down enough to keep perception functional during stress. That alone creates enormous advantage. Now, another major realization Greene pushes toward is that life rewards positioning far more than most people realize. Most individuals focus only on effort, and effort matters. But effort without positioning often becomes exhausting. Two people can work equally hard while getting dramatically different outcomes because one understands leverage and the other does not. This applies everywhere: career growth, relationships, leadership, financial opportunities, social influence. Positioning shapes probability. And Greene repeatedly demonstrates that strategic people quietly build environments and systems that increase the likelihood of favorable outcomes over time. This is one of the biggest differences between reactive people and strategic people. Reactive people repeatedly attempt to force outcomes emotionally. Strategic people shape conditions gradually. One hidden truth here is that small advantages compound over time. A slightly better reputation, a slightly stronger network, a slightly calmer emotional state, a slightly more disciplined routine. Repeated consistently over years, those small advantages become enormous separation. Now, one of the deepest lessons in the entire book is Greene's emphasis on reality over illusion. Most people spend enormous amounts of energy avoiding uncomfortable truths. They avoid seeing patterns clearly, recognizing toxic dynamics, admitting weaknesses, accepting changing conditions, confronting emotional habits, because emotionally denial feels safer temporarily. But Greene repeatedly shows that reality ignored eventually becomes reality enforced. And this is where strategic thinking becomes incredibly valuable psychologically. Strategic thinking reduces self-deception. Not perfectly. Everyone has blind spots. But strategic awareness forces people to observe incentives, patterns, timing, behavior, emotional reactions, power dynamics, long-term consequences more honestly. Now, another critical realization in this final section is that adaptability matters more than rigid strength. This becomes clearer and clearer throughout the entire book. Rigid people eventually break because life changes constantly. Flexible people survive pressure better because they can reposition without collapsing psychologically. And Greene repeatedly emphasizes that adaptability is not weakness. It is intelligence under changing conditions. This applies emotionally too. Many people become trapped because they emotionally attach themselves to old identities, old environments, old conflicts, old goals, old versions of themselves. Strategic people evolve, not randomly, not without values, intentionally. Now, one of the most important hidden layers underneath the entire book is energy management. Most people leak energy everywhere: unnecessary arguments, emotional reactions, constant distraction, overthinking, seeking validation, petty conflicts, chaotic environments, and over time this fragmentation weakens focus, discipline, and momentum. Greene repeatedly pushes toward concentration, directed energy, intentional focus. because concentrated effort consistently applied becomes extremely powerful over long periods of time. Now, another massive realization Greene reinforces is that confidence is often built through action, not thought. Many people wait to feel fully confident before acting. But confidence usually develops after repeated exposure, experience, adaptation, surviving pressure, learning from mistakes. Strategic people move despite uncertainty more often than reactive people do. And one hidden truth here is that courage is frequently behavioral before it becomes emotional. People become braver through repeated action, not endless internal preparation. Now, one of the deepest lessons in the entire book is the importance of maintaining internal independence, because modern life constantly pressures people psychologically. Social pressure, groupthink, emotional contagion, fear-based messaging, comparison, validation seeking. And Greene repeatedly warns that people who cannot think independently become highly controllable. Strategic people maintain observation even when emotionally pressured by groups or environments. That independence creates freedom psychologically. Now, if you step back and look at the entire philosophy of the 33 strategies of war, the ultimate lesson becomes surprisingly simple. Most people drift unconsciously through life reacting emotionally to circumstances. Strategic people become intentional. That intentionality changes outcomes dramatically over time. Not overnight, not magically, gradually. And one of the most important things to understand about Greene's work overall is that strategy is not just about conflict. It is about clarity. Clarity about yourself, other people, incentives, patterns, weaknesses, timing, environment, human psychology. Because once someone begins seeing clearly, they stop becoming easily destabilized by confusion, emotion, pressure, and unpredictability. That is real strategic power, how everything connects. The entire book functions like one integrated system. Self-control creates emotional stability. Emotional stability improves perception. Better perception improves decision-making. Better decision-making improves positioning. Better positioning creates leverage. Leverage creates flexibility. Flexibility improves adaptability. Adaptability improves long-term survival and growth. Everything reinforces everything else. This is why Greene repeatedly returns to awareness and emotional discipline across every section of the book. Without internal control, the rest collapses under pressure. Real-world integration plan. Daily behavior. Pause before emotional reactions. Study patterns instead of isolated incidents. Reduce unnecessary emotional conflicts. Protect your attention and focus intentionally. Observe people's behavior more carefully than their words. Weekly habits. Review recurring mistakes and emotional triggers. Strengthen systems instead of relying on motivation alone. Audit environments affecting your discipline, focus, and mindset. Develop skills steadily instead of emotionally rushing progress. Long-term systems. Build reputation through consistency. Create flexibility financially, professionally, and emotionally. Think in years instead of emotional moments. Prioritize adaptability over rigid identity. Focus on long-term positioning instead of short-term ego victories. Mental models. Not every battle deserves engagement. Emotional control creates leverage. Positioning matters more than force alone. Perception shapes outcomes constantly. Consistency compounds. Awareness reduces vulnerability. Patience improves clarity. Final mastery principles. The people most controlled by emotion are usually the easiest to destabilize. Most strategic advantage comes from awareness, positioning, and discipline rather than aggression. Temporary emotions should not dictate long-term decisions. People reveal themselves through repeated patterns more than isolated words. A calm and observant mind sees opportunities emotional minds miss. Strategic thinking is ultimately the ability to remain intentional while others become reactive. And that may be the deepest lesson in the entire book. End of the 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene.